The Great War began in 1914 when the Austro-Hungarian heir to the throne, Franz Ferdinand d'Este, was assassinated in Sarajevo. Austria-Hungary thought that Serbia had something to do with it, so they declared war. Austria are friends with Germany, known as the Central Powers. Serbia are friends with Russia, who's friends with France, known as the Allies. The war began, and the first move was made by Germany. Germany had a plan with a very fancy name to win the war. It takes Russia a very long time to mobilize their troops, so they quickly defeat France, move all their troops to Russia, and win the war. And yes, Hitler also used this strategy 20 years later. Anyway, France has tons of defenses along its border that will slow the Germans down, so they attack through neutral Belgium. This is a big no-no, so Britain declares war on the Central Powers. In Belgium, Germany had a bad time fighting with their enemy. What makes it worse, that Russia has mobilized their troops already and instantly began invading Austria. Meanwhile, the Germans were pushing into France, and now close to Paris. But everything went wrong when the French defeated them in the Battle of Marne. They had to retreat to defensive positions, and trench warfare began. A completely different style of warfare than used before. Both sides make lines of trenches with no man's land between them. Soldiers run out to no man's land, what is basically a suicide mission, because thousands of soldiers die while the heavy machine guns are firing at them. After waves of soldiers come, the side gives up or the trench is overrun. Soon the entire Western Front was at stalemate. The British gave the Germans a hard time by starting a naval blockade. So now, Germany was low on food. Another bloody frontier began in Italy, with terrible battles, like the Isonzo River. In the Middle East, the Ottoman Empire is very old and historical, but were stuck in medieval times while everyone else was in front of them. This made the country suffer, especially when they lost tons of land in the First Balkan War, so they weren't sure about joining the war. But some Ottomans wanted to, so they made a small naval attack on Russia and joined the Central Powers. They started some fronts that failed and blamed their failure on the Armenians living in their territory, what didn't go so well. The Allies also tried to land at Gallipoli to open the gates to Constantinople, now Istanbul. A short but brutal battle that the Ottomans managed to win. Back in Europe, Germany is using illegal poisonous gases and killing civilians to break the stalemate. So that's a shame. Another shame is that Austria-Hungary still didn't invade a little Serbia, but with some Bulgarian help, they finally did it. The Serbians retreated to Albania. Germany was pushing more and more into Russia's territory, so Russia began a costly offensive named the Brusilov Offensive. Right next to them, Armenia joined the Allies, but were no match for the two giants. But the Western Front is getting very bad. The Battle of Ypres had 250,000 casualties. The French lost 400,000 casualties at the Battle of Verdun, which led to the British fighting in the Battle of the Somme, with over 1 million casualties. The British also landed at Mesopotamia. The war was looking pretty bad on both sides, mainly in Russia, that was overthrown by a government that was overthrown again by a man by the name of Lenin, who signed peace with Germany. You may expect that Germany is pretty happy, but they're not, because America. You see, America was selling supplies to the British, and suddenly they have the best economy and military. So Germany sends a message to Mexico to attack them, but the message was caught by Britain, showed it to America, who now ships their men to France. Germany was desperate and tried everything to break the stalemate before the US troops arrived. But when that failed, the officers told Kaiser Wilhelm II that there's no hope for victory. This made him abdicate, with no heir to the throne. After launching a counterattack, Germany was pushed out of France. All hope was lost. Between that time, its allies collapsed, forming new countries. Eventually, at November the 11th, 1918, at 11 o'clock, Germany surrendered. The war suffered 20 million deaths, including 10 million civilians, making it one of the worst wars in history. The war completely changed the world. Germany now had terrible economy from the Treaty of Versailles and wanted the revenge. The Great War was marked as a war to end all wars. What is funny, because 20 years later, World War II began.